I remember the first time I stood before the great mound. It rose from the earth not like a natural hill, but like the handprint of a vanished people pressing upward toward the sky. Grass swayed gently on its slopes, and the air smelled of damp soil and summer heat. But it was silent, too silent for something that had once been the beating heart of a civilization. The year was not 1492. Columbus had yet to plant a flag in the Caribbean, yet here, in the middle of the North American continent, there had already been a city greater in size than London or Paris at the time. Its name, as we know it now, is Cahokia, though the people who lived here left us no written name for themselves. By the 15th century, Cahokia was already in decline, a decline that would soon become a collapse. But to understand why, we have to imagine what it was before the silence. The rise. Centuries earlier, Cahokia had risen in the fertile floodplains of the Mississippi River in what is now Illinois. Its people were the Mississippians, farmers, builders, astronomers, traders. Around 1050 CE, the city exploded in size. Earth was carried basket by, but with power came fragility. Its success depended on the river's rhythms, the fertility of the soil, and the delicate balance between its ruling elite and the thousands who labored under them. Shadows gathering. By the early 1400s, the cracks were showing. The Mississippi River, which had nourished Cahokia for centuries, began to shift its course. Floods alternated with droughts. Archaeologists would later find layers of silt where farmland had been. Evidence of repeated inundations. The elite's grand feasts, once a symbol of abundance, began to dwindle. Corn harvests failed more often. Famine became a whisper that passed through the neighborhoods. Tensions rose. Palisade walls were rebuilt, thicker and higher than before, suggesting fear of attack, perhaps from rival polities, perhaps from factions within. The mounds themselves, symbols of sacred authority, no longer held the same awe for everyone. And then something happened that archaeology can't fully explain. People began to leave. The Exodus. It didn't happen overnight. Families would quietly dismantle their homes, carry away possessions, and walk down the packed earth roads that led out of the city. Some went north toward the Great Lakes, others west toward the plains, others south along the Mississippi. By the mid-15th century, Cahokia's great plazas stood mostly empty. The Woodhenge, once a place where the sun's rise marked the sacred calendar, became weathered and abandoned. Grass began to reclaim the open spaces. We don't know exactly why they left. Perhaps it was hunger, perhaps conflict, perhaps a loss of faith in the ruling order. Oral traditions among descendant tribes, such as the Osage and the Choctaw, speak of great movements of people during times of trouble, guided by visions, dreams, or the flight of birds. A city in ruins. Imagine walking through Cahokia in those final years. You pass long houses with roofs collapsing inward. Clay pots, once filled with grain, now empty and cracked. Monk's Mound still looms, but the temple at its summit is half rotted. The air is quiet, except for the sound of the wind moving through the grass. The laughter of children, the drum beats of festivals, the chants of ceremonies, all gone. Yet the land holds memory. Beneath your feet are the footprints of thousands, the post holes of vanished walls, the fire pits where meals were shared. The city is dead, but its bones remain. The silence before the ships. When Europeans began arriving along the Atlantic coast in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Cahokia was already centuries gone. By then, the people who might have told its story had scattered, their descendants living in smaller, mobile communities, carrying only fragments of memory. And yet, when French explorers stumbled upon the mounds in the 17th century, they were astonished. "Who built these?" they asked. The local tribes said the mounds had always been there. Some said they were built by a people before then, people who had vanished. The French gave the name Cahokia after a nearby Illinois tribe, but that was not the builder's name. The true name is lost. Lessons from a vanished city. Today, archaeologists and anthropologists study Cahokia not just as a site of ruins, but as a mirror. It shows us how complex societies can rise rapidly and how they can fall. It reminds us that environmental shifts, political unrest, and economic imbalance can undo even the most powerful cities. The air in the Mississippi Valley during those years was heavy with change. I had walked its length from the north, where the waters ran cold and narrow, to the warm and swollen bends near the Gulf. Everywhere the land carried scars, not from swords, but from neglect. Abandoned farm plots were overgrown with wild sunflowers. Broken fish weirs stood like skeletal ribs in the shallows. And yet, here and there, signs of life clung stubbornly to the earth. A lone fisherman casting into the current, a family tending a small patch of maize in the shadow of the mounds. When I reached the remnants of Cahokia's central plaza, it was not silence I heard, but whispers, the sound of wind through dry grass, the distant calls of birds reclaiming the place. The once great city was no more than a memory of earth and wood, yet the arrangement of its mounds still spoke of design and purpose. I tried to imagine it as it had been 2 centuries before, when the plaza teemed with thousands, traders from distant valleys, artisans, farmers, and priests, all moving beneath banners that snapped in the wind. The elders I met in the scattered villages nearby spoke of those days as if they belonged to a dream. "There was a time," one old woman told me, her eyes clouded with age, "when you could not walk across the plaza without hearing 5 languages before you reached the other side. But something had broken that harmony. Some blamed the changing river, which had shifted its course, flooding certain fields and starving others of water. Others spoke of hunger, of maize crops that failed and hunters who returned empty-handed. The elders I met in the scattered villages nearby spoke of those days as if they belonged to a dream. There was a time," one old woman told me, her eyes clouded with age, "when you could not walk across the plaza without hearing 5 languages before you reached the other side. But something had broken that harmony. Some blamed the changing river, which had shifted its course, flooding certain fields and starving others of water. Others spoke of hunger, of maize crops that failed and hunters who returned empty-handed. Still others whispered of something darker, of the priests losing the favor of the gods, of ceremonies gone wrong, of omens ignored. In a culture where religion and governance were one, a loss of spiritual authority was as dangerous as famine. The people's faith had been the glue holding together a network of settlements spread across miles, and when that faith wavered, so too did the bonds between them. I followed the story south, across the lowlands and through forests alive with cicadas. Each village I visited added a fragment to the picture. One man told me of a great council that had failed, a meeting of leaders from across the valley who had gathered to decide how to respond to years of poor harvests. Instead of unity, there was division. Some wanted to send young men westward to find new lands. Others wanted to intensify rituals to appease the spirits. The debates grew heated. Accusations were hurled, and in the end, no plan was made. The council disbanded, each faction retreating to its own corner of the valley. That was when the raiding began. Not from distant enemies, but from neighbors. Grain stores were plundered. Hunting grounds once shared were suddenly claimed by force. Trade routes became dangerous, as caravans risked attack even before leaving their own territory. Cahokia's influence, once a unifying force, now existed only as a memory, invoked by elders and ignored by the young. As I walked, I could not help but feel the land itself was shifting under my feet. The Mississippi's moods were unpredictable. Heavy rains in the north could bring floods weeks later in the south. Some settlements were drowned in a season. Others found their fertile soils washed away into the river. I heard of whole families abandoning their homes, loading what little they could onto canoes, and paddling away without knowing where they would land. The turning point in the stories always seemed to be the same: a generation of leaders who could not hold their people together. Not because they lacked strength, but because the old ways no longer matched the world they lived in. Ceremonial calendars, planting rituals, and trade agreements, all built for a certain balance of nature and human cooperation, crumbled in the face of a changing climate and shifting alliances. One evening, in a riverside camp, I met a man named Talako, whose grandfather had been a boy in Cahokia's final days. We sat by the fire, the river's dark surface glinting with the light of the flames, as he told me what his grandfather had said. He remembered the smell of smoke before he saw the fire, Talako began. It was the great temple mound. People said it could never be touched, that it was the heart of the city. But that night, it burned. Some said it was lightning. Others swore they saw men with torches, men from within the city itself. When the fire died, the priests tried to rebuild, but the people had already taken it as a sign. They began to leave. That image of the great mound burning against the night sky stayed with me for the rest of my travels. It was the moment the spirit of Cahokia seemed to shatter. And yet, the descendants of those who left did not disappear. They scattered, some north to the Great Lakes, others west toward the plains, and still others south along the Mississippi, toward lands that would one day hold new cities. In each place, they carried fragments of Cahokia with them. The designs of their pottery, the patterns of their songs, the knowledge of the river's moods. The city died, but its people endured, adapting to the shifting world. And perhaps that, more than any mound or plaza, was Cahokia's true legacy. I left the Mississippi Valley with a strange mix of sorrow and admiration. Empires rise and fall, cities flourish and crumble, but the human will to move forward, to take what is useful from the past and carry it into an uncertain future, that endures.